Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Isabella of Valois. Isabella of Valois was born in 1389, the oldest surviving child of King Charles VI of France and his wife, Isabella of Bavaria. She should really have been named Isabella of France, but if you listen to the first episode, you know we already have an Isabella of France, so to keep it straight, the historians named her Isabella of Valois. If you remember the Isabella from episode 1, she was from the Capetian family. This Isabella that we're talking about this week, though also French and from the same family, was from the Valois branch of the royal family. So, Isabella of Valois. Her parents were the king and queen of France, so she grew up a French princess, at least for a little while. When her parents met, her father didn't speak German, and her mother didn't speak French. But even so, Isabel made a good impression on Charles, and they were married just a few days later. The royal couple had 2 children that didn't survive their infancy. When Isabella was born, she had an older sibling that died just after her birth, making her, fairly early in her life, the couple's oldest surviving child. The royal couple didn't slow down, averaging a baby about every 12 months. When Isabella was 3, her sister Jeanne was 2, her brother Charles was 1, and her mother was about to have another baby, when her father showed his first signs of his mental illness. This would be his first episode, but far from his last. King Charles was a 23-year-old king, husband, and father of almost 4. One of his friends and advisors had survived an assassination attempt. The king put together an army to bring the would-be assassin to justice. And while they were preparing to leave, King Charles was described as being in a fever with disconnected speech. It was strange, for sure, but not really a red flag large enough to tell your king, no, I'm not going to go. It was summertime, and once they were off, the army was making very slow progress. They were hot and wearing metal armor, walking around in their own little ovens. King Charles was worked up into an impatient frenzy. We've probably all been there. Like, can we just get going, please? One morning, a barefoot leper dressed in rags approached the king's horse, grabbing for the bridle. I didn't know what the bridle was, so I asked my sister-in-law, Davida. She knows horses because she has horses, and she told me the bridle was the straps on the horse's face, on their muzzle. Clearly, I'm a horse novice, but phony friend is always an option, and my knowledge lies elsewhere. Anyway, back to King Charles and the leper grabbing the bridle. The leper yelled, "Ride no further, noble king. Turn back. You are betrayed." The guards beat the man back, but did not apprehend him. What would they do with him? They were marching to war to fight a wannabe assassin. But no one could have guessed how poorly this was about to go. The man followed the king and his troops for 30 minutes, repeating his warnings. Around noon, the army was coming out of the forest when one of his pages dropped his lance, being tired from the heat. The king's lance hit a helmet on the way down, being carried by another page, making a loud clanging noise. King Charles visibly shuddered, drew his sword, and shouted, "Forward against the traitors! They wish to deliver me to the enemy." Then he spurred his horse and attacked his own men. Eventually, he was subdued, but only after killing 4 of his own men. Once subdued, the king didn't struggle. Instead, he sunk into a coma. Keep in mind that this was the 14th century. There was no way to keep the comatose king alive, and they didn't expect him to live long. They used the best medical practices of the time and took the king to a nearby castle where they hoped the rest and the good air would help him. The king's uncle Philip assumed the regency immediately. He had done it before. His nephew had become king as a child and had only recently been acting as king on his own. Philip was the obvious choice for regent because he'd been there before. Philip's first order of business was to dismiss a bunch of the young king's advisors. He wasn't messing around. King Charles did wake up from his coma and was devastated to learn what he had done. He went on to slip in and out of reality for the rest of his life, having at least 44 episodes that we know about. Sometimes not knowing if he was king or even what his own name was. Sometimes being terrified of his wife and not recognizing his own children. He would roam the castle halls, howling at night. And for a while, he even thought he was made of glass and was terrified he would shatter. He wouldn't allow anyone to touch him, and he had metal sewn into his clothes as a kind of exoskeleton to protect his fragile glass body from breaking. Later that same month, Queen Isabeau had her fourth child, a girl named Princess Marie. 2 years later, they added another princess, Michelle. This whole time, the king was slipping in and out of reality. At one point, all of the French Jews were expelled from France. Anti-Semitism was all over Western Europe at this time, and politicians had a way of throwing them under the bus at every opportunity. I don't know if it was King Charles or his regent Philip, but one of the Valois men expelled all the Jews out of France. Dick move. So things obviously weren't very stable in France during this time. During 1395 and 96, King Charles thought that he was St. George, the patron saint of England. Everyone went along with it. Despite his difficulties, he was well liked. He was known as Charles the Beloved or Charles the Mad, depending on who you asked. Except for a couple of times, he wasn't really dangerous. I mean, he did kill those 4 troops early on, but he wasn't, for the most part, dangerous. He was just ill-equipped to become the king. I explain all of this to say that Isabella's childhood wasn't very stable. The 100 Years' War was still raging, and England was winning. The King Edward III years had been hard on France and the Valois family, and now France had a mentally unwell king. It wasn't looking great for the House of Valois. But the rumor was that the now King of England, Richard II, wanted peace. He had fought the Lords Appellant over that very issue and was back in power now. And having lost his first wife, he was looking for another one. So France suggested peace and offered King Charles' oldest daughter, Isabella, to King Richard in exchange for 28 years of peace. Why 28 years? I have no idea. But Richard was 28 at the time, so I like to think he was like, look, I just did 28 years of war. How about we try 28 years of peace? England accepted. Problem solved. Except for one thing. King Charles' oldest daughter, Isabella, was still only 6 years old. A first grader. Part of the marriage contract was Richard agreeing not to consummate the marriage until Isabella came of age. Unfortunately, she would come of age at 12, so still super young, and I don't like it either. All I can say is that Richard is the king that we suspect might have been in the cult of Edward the Confessor, and if he was in the cult of Edward the Confessor, he had taken a vow of celibacy, and he would not consummate any marriage. He had no children with his first wife, Anne of Bohemia. She has her own episode. Check it out. It's possible that if he was celibate, this gave him an excuse not to have an heir yet. King Richard did also want peace. This could have been the way to get 28 years of peace from his grandfather's war. The planned peace would last until Richard was 56. King Richard said she was still too young to have children with, and when she was 12 or 13, she would still be too young. So at least he realized that. But he also said that this was for the best because he could bring her up as he saw fit. If he was talking about his child bride, that's what we call grooming. Ew. But a lot of people compared the relationship to a father-daughter relationship or a doting uncle. Again, so creepy if this is his wife. Not as much if he was looking at it like he was adopting a child to get out of an awkward situation. But I really don't like anything about it. As far as Isabella goes, when she was asked about being the Queen of England, she said, without any prompting, "If it pleases God and my Lord and Father that I should be Queen of England, I shall gladly accept my lot, for they tell me that I should then be a great lady." Because she was a 6-year-old that had clearly been coached. Unfortunately, that kind of thing wasn't a red flag back in the 14th century. So all they noted was that she was pleasant, pretty, and well-spoken. The deal was made, and 6-year-old Isabella traveled to Calais to be married to the 28-year-old King Richard. Calais was formerly French land, but since Edward III, it was held by the English. It was as close to neutral territory as they could find, and also a reminder to the French that England was indeed winning the war, because they owned Calais. On the last day of October, 1396, Isabella was in Calais, and here is what we know about that day. A tearful Isabella, dressed in a blue velvet dress sewn with fleur-de-lis, wearing a diadem of gold and pearls, was carried by the Dukes Berry and Burgundy to Richard's pavilion. She was taken away by a group of English ladies led by the Duchesses Lancaster and Gloucester. 4 days later, on the 4th of November, 1396, she was brought to the church of St. Nicholas in Calais, where Richard married her. She was 5 days short of her 7th birthday. Her dolls were included in her trousseau. Do you know what I did on my 7th birthday? I got one ear pierced and then locked myself in the bathroom until my mother threatened me. But at least I didn't have to get married. Here's what we can take from this passage. She was crying, probably because she was 6 and didn't realize that getting married meant she would have to move away from her mother to another country. Her dress was blue with gold fleur-de-lis, so very, very French looking. She was also wearing a small golden crown with pearls. Anyone that saw her would know she was a French princess. She was being carried by the Dukes Berry and Burgundy, her father's uncles, and regents when he was ill, at 54 and 56 respectively, making me think that her father may have been mentally unwell at this time, and her great-uncles were the ones agreeing to this marriage. And she was being carried because she was a crying 6-year-old. She was then led away by some English ladies. These ladies were John of Gaunt's governess-turned-mistress-turned-wife, now 47-year-old Catherine Swynford, and Thomas of Woodstock's wife, 30-year-old Eleanor de Bohun, the king's aunts, who also both have an episode if you need a refresher. 4 days later, she got married, just 5 days before she turned 7. She was so young that some of her bridal possessions that she brought with her were her toys, her dolls, because she was only 6 years old. If I'm honest, I'm judging almost all of the adults in this situation. I know things were different back then, and they didn't have as much information, but I just can't imagine feeling okay with this. When Isabella got to England, she had her own household and court, supervised by her governess and a chief lady-in-waiting. She was learning how to run her own household. Richard visited her occasionally, but she was treated more like an English royal child would be. The following year, she was crowned Queen of England at 7. She seemed to enjoy King Richard's visits, and he always brought her gifts and toys. If you watch the BBC's Hollow Crown, you see an adult Richard, but Isabella is portrayed as at least an older teenager, as opposed to a child of 6 or 7. In May 1399, Isabella was 9 years old. She was moving to a safer castle, while Richard went on military campaign in Ireland. The next month, Isabella's uncle took over as regent for her mentally ill father. He decided that peace with England was overrated. He allowed the king's exiled cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, to return to England from France, where he had been staying. Henry Bolingbroke had been disinherited by King Richard when his father, John of Gaunt, had died. Henry wanted his duchy back. He took advantage of Richard being away in Ireland and found he had a lot of support from Richard's nobles. The man who had been left in charge, Lord Protector of the realm, was 58-year-old Edmund of York, the uncle of both King Richard and Henry Bolingbroke. Their uncle had at first raised an army to fight against Henry, but perhaps, seeing the support Henry had, switched sides, handing the country over to his nephew Henry. Isabella had been moved from castle to castle for 2 months, until King Richard surrendered and was imprisoned in London. The next month, Henry was crowned King Henry IV of England. The king is not dead yet. Long live the king? A couple of months later, in December, a group of pro-Richard nobles got together to make a plan. They planned to kidnap the king at the Feast of Epiphany. They called their plan Epiphany Rising, because no one can turn down a cool nickname. They hoped to catch the king at the tournament, kill him, and restore Richard to the throne. They were betrayed, and King Henry didn't show up to his kidnapping. He raised an army instead. These pro-Richard nobles had gone to visit Queen Isabella, and when they found out, she was moved again and put under heavier security. She was now still only 10 years old, a 4th grader. A couple of months later, Richard died. It was thought that he had been starved to death, the thought process being that if he was starved to death, it didn't count as murder, and they couldn't have been accused of murdering an ordained king who had been anointed with holy oil in front of God. But they were the ones withholding food, so sure, Jan. The French requested the return of their 10-year-old princess and her dowry, as they had the right to do, as stated in the marriage contract, if the marriage had never been consummated. Until this point, France had supported King Henry. Until now, that is, because Henry declined their request. He did, however, make a counteroffer. He would betroth his son, Prince Henry, because of course his name was Henry, to Isabella. It was also simple. They could keep the princess and her dowry, and she was to marry the oldest son of the king, and she would eventually become Queen of England, just as had originally been the plan. King Henry argued that his son, Prince Henry, at 13, was a much better match for the princess than her previous husband had been. Isabella flat refused, and at the age of 10 went into mourning for her husband, King Richard. King Richard II was the last Plantagenet king. Like when France changed from the Capetian line to the Valois line, England was going from the Plantagenet line to the Lancastrian line. The House of Lancaster had begun their rise when Blanche of Lancaster married the king's son, and now her only son was the King of England. John of Gaunt never became king of anything, but his only son with Blanche was King of England. His oldest daughter with Blanche was the Queen of Portugal, and his only daughter with Constance was now the Queen of Castile. The House of Lancaster had now become very powerful. His ambition had outlived him. Again, if you watch the BBC's Hollow Crown, Patrick Stewart plays John of Gaunt. Shakespeare portrayed John as a much more dignified, wiser, older man. Me and Shakespeare have a different opinion of him. So back to Isabella and her marriage offer from the king's son. She refused and went into mourning. I like to think she had realized how much power she had, but she was also still just 10. A 4th grader. A 4th grader who had her own household and court and was queen of a country. I don't really know what she was thinking, but I'm here to give her the benefit of the doubt, as I do, and I think she was a 4th grader who was running circles around these grown men. That doesn't make me less frustrated that she was put in this position, though. In August 1401, when Isabella was 11, she was finally returned to France, though without her dowry. That dowry did not buy peace, or even an alliance as it was intended, but things tend to get chaotic when a king is deposed. Things in France had changed in the last 5 years while 11-year-old Isabella was Queen of England. Her father was still mentally ill and having episodes regularly, and her great-uncle Philip was back to running the country. Her mother had had 2 more children, Louis 4, and John 1. And she was pregnant again. One of her younger sisters had been married, also young, and was off in her own household. One of her sisters had been dedicated to God. That's what they call it when they donated a child to the priory to be raised and trained as a nun. When she was about 4, people started to see signs that she may have inherited her father's mental illness. I don't know how anyone could have deduced that a 4-year-old was having issues with her mental health. Most 4-year-olds are little narcissists. Everyone is a side character in their life. But most of them mature and grow out of it. But mental health diagnoses and treatments were not in their heyday. So they sent the 4-year-old to the priory. At least she wasn't getting married. Her 7-year-old sister and 5-year-old brother, who had been babies when she left, were still at home in the royal nursery with the 2 newest babies. Philip, who was acting as regent, is known for outlawing Gamay grapes in favor of Pinot Noir grapes. So if you like Pinot Noir, you have him to thank for its popularity. Isabella's uncle Louis was fighting his own uncle Philip for regency. The men in France were grappling over political position. They were also arguing over custodianship of the royal children, or more accurately, the right to marry off the royal children to form alliances. Isabella's mother kept up her side of the deal and added another princess to the royal nursery, Princess Catherine of Valois. Sneak peek, baby Catherine will become Queen of England, just like her sister, and will have her own episode soon. So stay tuned for her. And 2 years after her, the birth of Prince Charles. Isabella was still just 13, and still a Dowager Queen of England. Isabella's great-uncle and Lord Protector, if you can't hear, there's heavy air quotes around the word protector. Protector of Pinot Noir, maybe. But in any case, he died. He died of natural causes in Hainaut, or modern-day Belgium, so good for him. Dying of natural causes was a rare privilege for just a few in the early 15th century. Philip's son assumed his duties and became the one fighting his cousin for control of the throne. A couple of years later, King Henry of England was still looking for a wife for his now 19-year-old son, Prince Henry. For some reason, they were struggling to find a wife for the prince. It could be because succession was still unstable. King Henry was the first Lancastrian king, and other monarchs would have considered that a risk. They weren't established. There's no sign that Prince Henry's accession to the throne would be peaceful. And a lot of them probably didn't want to put their daughters in that position. But I have another theory. Take a moment, if you will, and Google King Henry V of England. I think it was the hair. Tell me the hair wasn't some kind of princess repellent. Prince Hal, as he was called, because there was Henrys everywhere, probably also required a pretty large dowry. He would need it to add to his legitimacy and be able to powerfully ascend to the throne when the time came. A few other marriage negotiations fell through, and the Lancastrians returned to Isabella and asked her again if she would consider marrying Prince Hal. Isabella again refused. Or more likely, her Lord Protector declined. Isabella had no real say in this decision, though it does seem like she agreed with it. She had little to no interest in returning to England. Isabella, now 16, was then married again. Not to a king, like she had been a decade before, this time to her 11-year-old cousin, Charles of Orleans. If that sounds familiar, that would be because this particular cousin was the son of Louis, Duke of Orleans, Isabella's uncle, and current Lord Protector of the realm. So she married his son, but not willingly it seems. For the second time in a decade, a tearful Isabella arrived to be married. She cried the entire wedding, and they didn't seem to be tears of happiness. The very next year, Isabella's uncle, or father-in-law, depending on your perspective, was assassinated. He was stabbed in Paris while attempting to mount his horse. The stabber? 15 masked men. The French were theatrical and not taking any chances. He was assassinated on the orders of his cousin, the son of his uncle Philip, John the Fearless. Louis and his cousin had beef. There were rumors that Louis was having an affair with his sister-in-law Isabeau, Queen of France, and the wife of Charles the Beloved, or mad, again, depending on who you asked. His cousin John believed these rumors, it seemed, and claimed lawful assassination. Lawful assassination seems like an oxymoron, but you could legally assassinate someone who was poorly running the country, and John believed this was the case with Louis. Louis's assassination started a civil war in the French royal family that lasted for 28 years. Just a couple of years into the Civil War, 19-year-old Isabella, still married to her now 14-year-old cousin, was pregnant. This was the timer for her life, because Isabella did not survive this birth. She died at the age of 19, never becoming a full adult. It seems strange to think of her as still a teenager. She had lived more life than most 19-year-olds. Her baby, a little girl named Joan, did survive, but only for 22 years. The French Civil War was still ongoing. Joan's cause of death isn't known, and she never had any children. Isabella's cousin husband, because that's what I'm going to call him, I guess, fought for France in the Battle of Agincourt against Prince Hal, who, spoiler alert, was now King Henry V. The English had won the battle in an upset victory. This time period is covered in Netflix's The King. The King seems to be a fairly accurate account of this time, but Robert Pattinson falling in the mud, that part never happened. He probably wasn't even there. But give it a watch. It's pretty good. I recommend it. Back to Charles, the cousin husband. He was discovered after the battle uninjured under a pile of corpses, likely hiding. So points for survival, I guess, but it didn't work. He was captured and put in English prison. In prison, he seemed to have found himself. He became a poet. He was more of a lover than a fighter, and he lived to the, at the time, very old age of 70. Isabella's younger brother Charles would become the King of France. Despite the rumors that his uncle Louis was his real father, he was aided in his ascension by the teenage Joan of Arc, but we'll get back to that later. He was known as Charles the Victorious for being the French king that ended the 100 Years' War. We're getting close to the end, guys. That war was so long. Isabella's younger sister, Catherine, became Queen of England just like her sister. But again, we'll get back to that. She, unlike her sister, was 19 when she got married. So it seems like the people running France had grown a bit, matured, started marrying off adult princesses. Isabella also had an illegitimate half-sister. Queen Isabeau had made royal mistress an official job at court to service the king during his episodes when he was afraid of his wife. The mistress kind of looked like the queen. King Charles, it seemed, had a type. The 2-year-old, named Marguerite, was later legitimized by her half-brother, King Charles the Victorious. And that is where we will leave it for this week. What did you think? Isabella's life was short, only about 19 years, and somewhat forgotten. She's sometimes mentioned in accounts of her sister, Queen Catherine, as Catherine's older sister, the child bride of Richard II. But that's usually about it. Though her short life was filled with more life experiences than most of her contemporaries. I wish her life had been happier. She seemed to go through her life managing tough situations for nearly 2 decades. But she stayed strong through it all. But I so badly wish she had experienced more joy and had adults in her life who looked out for her best interest instead of theirs. But she was a survivor during her short life for sure. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. Let me know what you think of this saga and what should our next saga be. Long live to all the queens out there, and until next week, bye.